Elias Danner set the hoe down and moved toward the sound, boots soft against the dry, packed earth. The chicken coop door creaked as he pressed it open, letting in a sliver of slate-colored light that slipped over the straw and came to rest on the face of the girl curled within. She wasn't a vagrant, not some runaway field hand. She wore a wedding dress, ivory once, now stained and torn, the hem ragged with mud and travel. A strip of lace clung to her wrist, frayed and trembling as she shifted in sleep. Her eyes didn't open. They only pinched tighter against the light, as if even unconscious she expected the world to reach in and take what little was left. One cheek was mottled blue and purple, the shape of a hand pressed there with cruel intention, unapologetic. Clutched to her chest was a small leather pouch, worn and bound tight. Elias stood still, watching. Then he bent at the knees, laid down an old wool blanket just inside the doorway, placed a jug of warm water beside it. He didn't call out, didn't try to rouse her. His voice was low, steady, meant not to wake but to offer something true. "There's a fire going in the house. If you want, you can come in." The first breath of winter slipped through the crooked fence, brushing against weather-worn timber like whispers too tired to demand a reply. Out on the gray-yellow fields at the edge of Wyoming, frost blanketed the earth like ash from a long-dead fire. Everything was still. Only the whine of rusted hinges matched the wind's rhythm, and at the end of it, there she was. Clara Hollis, still bearing a dusting of white powder across her wedding bodice, dragged herself past the broken fence, legs scraped raw, hands stone cold, and found an abandoned chicken coop. Slanted roof, splintered walls, straw scattered with feathers. But it was the only place that didn't turn her away. She didn't cry. She'd run dry somewhere between the thickets and back roads, after more than a week slipping through forest, hitching wagons, sleeping beside tree hollows, dodging voices that bore the name Trennan. The soft leather pouch pressed tight to her chest wasn't kept for worth. It was the last thing that belonged to her mother. Inside, a faded handkerchief, a few coins, and a letter never mailed. She had meant to turn herself in more than once, but her feet kept moving, as if her body still believed in something her mind had long since given up denying. 3 nights, she slept beneath the pecking of hens and the mold-sweet scent of straw, among sounds the town hadn't yet learned to name. 3 nights with an empty stomach and a heart trained to flinch. The first, she heard gunshots crack somewhere distant, followed by the cry of a horse. The second, it was so cold her hands wouldn't close when she tried to draw her dress over her head. The third, she slept. Not deeply, but truly, for the first time. Like a wild thing run too long, finally collapsing when its heart had nowhere left to hide. And on the third morning, the wind changed. Heavy footsteps crossed the frost-hardened yard. Steady, unhurried. She shrank deeper into the shadows, fingers curled tight around her pouch, eyes cracked open beneath the straw. The wooden door opened with a groan, slicing clean through the silence. A man stood in the doorway, faded wool coat, uncombed hair, boots caked in mud. He didn't shout, didn't retreat. His eyes met hers through the dim light. No rage, no pity, only something that looked an awful lot like recognition. His voice was quiet, low and rough, like a man unused to talking before breakfast. "There's a fire going inside. And coffee." A pause. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." Clara didn't move. Not from fear, but because for the first time, words like that weren't followed by a price. He didn't come closer, just stood there, letting the space between them remain a choice, not a command. Then he turned and walked away. Elias Danner wasn't the kind to go rescuing people. He lived alone on this stretch of land after the war had stripped away most of what he used to believe in. His wife had died before their daughter could say daddy proper. Every morning, he rose before the sun, chopped wood, fed the hens, patched the fence. He asked for nothing more than for tomorrow to look the same as today, and not worse, if he was lucky. But the hens wouldn't shut up this morning. Flapping, pecking at the door, shrieking like a wolf had broken in. Now he knew why. He returned a little later with a tin cup still steaming, set it down on the step of the coop. Didn't say a word, just left it there and walked away. When he came back again, the cup was empty. By noon, the sun had pierced through the thinning canopy, not enough to warm the soil, but enough for Elias to spot the torn hem of her dress snagged on the coop when she tried to rise. She stood with difficulty. He reached out, not in demand, but in offer. She looked at him a moment, then gave a slow nod. She didn't give her name. He didn't ask. He led her to the small cabin tucked behind the ridge. Not grand, but solid. Sadie, his daughter, had just stepped out when she saw the strange woman with tangled hair and dried mud streaked across her brow. She didn't flinch, didn't question, just looked. "She's tired," Elias said, as if that was all anyone needed to know. Sadie stepped back, opened the door, an invitation spoken in silence. Elias laid an old wool blanket across the bench near the stove. He reheated water. No tea, but it was warm. Clara sat down, both hands wrapped around the tin, as if anchoring herself to a reality that, for once, didn't spit her out. They didn't speak much. He kept his distance, peeling potatoes. The fire crackled soft in the hearth. Wind brushing past the windows like it, too, wanted to ask questions. "Thank you," she whispered, voice hoarse, brittle, like it hadn't been used in days. He nodded, like he'd heard all the words she hadn't said. Sadie came back with a pair of small wool socks, held them out, then turned without a word. A simple gesture, but one that carried more weight than a welcome. Clara lowered her face into the steam of her cup. Her eyes burned, and it wasn't from smoke. When night fell, Elias stood on the porch, eyes fixed on the flicker of distant lanterns from the town across the valley. He knew someone would come asking, sooner or later. But not tonight. Tonight, he only remembered the look in her eyes. No begging, no clinging, just a quiet plea to hold on to the last piece of self the world hadn't taken. No one sleeps 3 nights in a chicken coop unless they're running from something colder than frost. Elias didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but he knew that look. He'd worn it once himself, in a field hospital near Shiloh, when no one came to claim him for 14 straight days. And sometimes, seeing someone is enough. Morning came before the warmth did. The sun barely managed a pale stroke of gold along the distant ridge, while the frost still clung thick as ash on every window pane. Inside the cabin, the only sound that dared disturb the hush was the soft pop of kindling in the hearth. Clara, or the name she now offered, May, hadn't said much more since. She was up early, not from habit, but from never truly sleeping. When Elias came downstairs, coat pulled on over his shoulders, he found her already at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a tin cup, gaze fixed on something far beyond the window. Motionless, but more awake than anyone else in the house. He didn't speak, just crouched to stoke the fire, fed it more wood, and walked over to the shelf where he kept the old loaves of bread. She stirred her hot water with a spoon, Not for taste, but because her hands needed something to do to keep from trembling. The wedding dress was gone, replaced by a plain brown frock that once belonged to someone else. A past wife, maybe, or Elias's mother, or simply a garment left behind by time. Too long for her, but clean, and not steeped in the scent of memory, May. She'd whispered it, setting the name down like a coin on a counter no one would ask to verify. No reasons, no persuasion, just a word. Elias met her eyes, gave a small nod. Enough to acknowledge, not enough to confirm, but he didn't need more. Sadie crept from the bedroom, clutching a ragged cloth doll with straw hair and a crooked nose. She stopped a few feet away, watching with wide, unafraid eyes. Clara, May, didn't smile, but she gave a slight nod, just enough to say she wasn't a threat. Sadie placed a small slice of bread on the plate beside the sofa, then darted away. A wordless act. No more than a greeting, but it made May reach for the plate like she was touching something fragile. Rowan was different. He stood by the doorframe, shoulder leaning against the wall, one hand buried in his pocket, the other chewing on a piece of straw between his teeth. His gaze wasn't curious. It was judgment waiting for proof. He'd seen folks like her before. Drifters his father once helped, who later vanished with a tool, a horse, or worse, trust. He didn't believe her. She knew that. But he didn't say it aloud, because in this house, Elias didn't allow insult to come from words, only from the truth made clear over time. No one asked her where she came from over breakfast. Elias sliced the ham evenly, laid it across 4 plates. May barely ate. Her hands rested on the table, thumb brushing the calloused scar on her knuckle, where dry dirt still clung. When the sudden sound of hooves echoed along the dirt road outside, not urgent, not fast, she flinched. Not enough to fall, but enough for Elias to notice. Her hand froze mid-air. The air tightened like a stretched string. She took one long breath, then quietly set her slice of meat down and reached for her water. Elias kept eating, same as before, but his eyes had already flicked toward the window. No wagon, just a lone traveler passing through. Still, that single reaction said more than any story she might invent. At day's end, he handed her an old pair of gloves, leather worn thin, but warm enough, and gestured toward the porch. I could use someone to sweep the steps. Not a command, an invitation, a way to make her feel useful, or at least not invisible. May nodded. She worked without instruction, movements practiced, modest, unhurried. A woman raised in structure, though clearly not one taught to escape it. Rowan watched in silence from the kitchen doorway. Elias noticed the boy didn't speak, but for him, silence was often enough. Silence, too, was a language. Evening fell fast on this stretch of land. As the sky turned indigo, Elias rekindled the fire. The little house glowed with its warmth, pushing back the dark beyond the pinewood walls. May sat near the stove, stitching the torn sleeve of Sadie's dress with thread from an old wooden box. She hadn't asked for it. She just did it, the way people do when life has taught them that taking nothing more than what's needed is the best way to be left alone. Sadie sat beside her, glancing over now and then, sometimes smiling, as if some small part of her believed her mother had returned in a different form. Elias cleaned his rifle, not to threaten, just habit. But his eyes never strayed far from May's hands. She'd told him nothing, but every movement was a sentence. Her stitching was slow, but steady. Not from fear, from the quiet awe of touching something that wouldn't break. When the night deepened, May stood, placed the needle back in the box, returned it exactly where she found it. Elias gave a nod, said nothing, but in his eyes was something close to assent. She didn't have to ask. She was staying, at least through the night. At the threshold of the small room set aside for her, she paused. "Thank you," she said, for the second time. Elias looked up, didn't smile, didn't speak, but he no longer looked at her like a stranger. When the door clicked shut, Elias returned to the fire, added another log. The flames caught and curled. Rowan stepped beside him, hands still deep in his pockets. After a beat, he spoke. "She says her name is May. But that's not her real name." Elias didn't turn. "I know." "Then why didn't you ask?" Elias smiled, softly for the first time that day, like a breeze brushing down the side of a mountain. "Because sometimes what a person needs most is to lie and not be sent away for it." Rowan didn't answer, but this time, when he looked toward her door, it wasn't with suspicion. It was with waiting. Her silence was a storm, not loud, not wet, but enough to change the air in a house that had long lived on duty alone. And Elias knew the storm would come again. But tonight, he didn't fear it. Because in that silence, for the first time someone was learning how to stay. Willow Bend was not a town with much to look at, and even less to remember. A row of wooden buildings leaning with the mountain wind, blacksmith shop, church, a one-room schoolhouse. Folks here knew each other, not in the neighborly sense, but in the kind that remembered faces, horse names, and how many sacks of grain someone still owed. So when August Trennan rode into town on a Wednesday morning, boots polished to a beeswax shine, collar starched stiff, and gloves that had never touched dust, everything that was Willow Bend stood still and watched. No one asked what he wanted, but every soul in the market, the bakery, the forge, silently arrived at the same conclusion. This man wasn't here to stay, and he damn sure wasn't here for old friends. He stopped in front of Neely's general store, dismounted with the kind of precision that felt closer to drawing a blade than dismounting a horse. His face didn't crease. His gaze didn't waver. When he placed the letter on the counter and said, "For May Hollis, if she happens to be around," Mrs. Neely lifted her head. Her eyes were old, but they hadn't dulled. "Ain't no one by that name in the books, but I can ask around." August nodded once, then walked away, as if the answer meant little, as if the scene had been rehearsed, and he was simply playing his part. 4 hours later, Elias Danner stepped into the same store for salt and fresh rope. Mrs. Neely mentioned it, almost offhand. Someone came asking for a May Hollis. Then she pulled the letter out, sealed with wax, thick paper, black ink like midnight. Elias said nothing, just took it, nodded, and walked out like he'd never heard the name in his life. Clara was stewing vegetables in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, sweat blooming at her temples. Her hands, clean now, still carried the faint red trace of too many hours holding a broom handle. Sadie hummed on the floor, legs crossed, a rag doll in her lap. Rowan read near the hearth, silent as always. Elias walked in, set the package on the table. The door behind him hadn't closed fully, and the draft caught Clara's neck the very moment Elias placed the letter on the shelf. She turned and saw the wax seal. Her hand tightened around the ladle. Then the ladle dropped, clattering against the cast iron pot with a sharp metallic clang that cut through the small room. Her face went pale, but her eyes went hollow, as if she were looking through the kitchen wall and into a room that once held her prisoner. as if she could still hear the latch locking behind her. Elias didn't speak. He just stood there, dust still clinging to his sleeves from the new rope. A silent shape, a boundary stone that wouldn't trespass into someone else's memory. Clara didn't pick the spoon up, didn't run. She just stepped back once, careful, as if afraid she might break something, even though this house had nothing left to shatter. That night, the wind rose. No storm, but gray clouds sagged against the mountain like a wound refusing to close. Sadie fell asleep first, doll curled against her stomach. Rowan lay down, but didn't close his eyes. Clara sat on the porch, Elias's coat draped over her shoulders. Not asked for, but given. She didn't speak until Elias dragged a wooden chair beside hers. The wind rustled the trees like voices whispering truths too dangerous to repeat. Then she began. She didn't look at him, didn't lift her head. His name is August Trennan, the man my father chose for me to marry. Her voice didn't shake, but each word sliced through the wind like a thread pulled from deep inside. They needed an alliance, a way to keep land, keep their name. I was just a piece in that. She paused, took a breath sharp as glass. The first time I resisted, he locked me in the woodshed. 5 hours. No light. No water. The second time, he didn't hit me. Just showed me what happened to the woman before me. The first wife, he said, had gone mad and vanished. Elias didn't speak, didn't interrupt, but his fingers curled tighter around the chair's arm. Small, silent, but enough to betray the stillness. Clara continued, voice lower now, but clearer. My mother once told me, if you have no voice, at least keep your name. So I didn't tell you my real one. Truth is, I'm not sure how much of it I still have left. A long moment passed before she whispered, like a final confession. If I hadn't run, I'd be dead by now, and no one would have cared. The wind hushed, the air between them thick as ash against a cabin wall. Elias turned to her, for the first time really looking, not like a man confirming facts, but like someone who already knew without needing to ask. You're still alive, he said. That means someone cared. Just one sentence, but it knocked loose a chain. Clara didn't answer, but her gaze no longer darted, no longer fled. Much later, she said, You don't have to believe me. What I said. Elias blinked. Don't need to, he replied. Because truth wasn't in the words. It was in the way her hand pressed to her chest every time a horse rode by, in how she never turned her back when she slept, in the look that always sought an exit, even from the safety of a kitchen. And more than anything, it lived in her silence, a storm that never broke, but altered the whole weather of a place simply by being there. That morning, Elias didn't go out to the field like he usually did. He left the hoe leaning by the back door, let the hens peck at the ground beneath the porch on their own, let his coat hang loose, forgotten on its hook, like a habit misplaced for the first time in years. Clara sat on the steps, brushing Sadie's hair, eyes cast toward the mountains, where the morning clouds stretched like scattered ash. She still wore the name May in the minds of others, but to herself, it had become a kind of hiding place. Not an identity, but a last fence between her and the things too fragile to face. Elias sat beside her, not too close, just enough that his voice wouldn't get lost in the wind. August has papers, he said slowly. Money, people, and sooner or later, he'll come back. Clara didn't respond, but her shoulders tightened like an old door right before the latch gives. If you agree to a marriage, legal, he paused, let the wind pass through. He can't touch you. Not with the laws here. Not in this state. Clara turned, her eyes landing on his hands. Rough, dusted with soot. No ring, no flowers, no proposal. Just a sentence, a fact. Are you asking me to marry you? She asked, voice not cold, but no longer cautious. Not for love, Elias answered plainly. Just for choice. To stay, as someone with rights, not as a guest. Clara let out a breath of a laugh. It barely made a sound. I don't have anything to give. Still breathing, Elias said. That's enough. That night, Clara didn't sleep on the couch like she usually did. She lay beside Sadie. The little girl had pulled her into the room with a hug that didn't wait for permission. Her tiny arm wrapped around Clara's waist in sleep, her head tucked against Clara's neck like it had always belonged there. Around midnight, Clara woke, not from a nightmare, but because the peace was so unfamiliar. She stared at the ceiling as if trying to read an unopened letter. This man, Elias, hadn't touched her, hadn't asked for anything but a signature and silence. And it was that, more than anything, that made her tremble. Too many had claimed love and demanded her soul, but now, for the first time, someone was asking her to stay, with no cost attached. She turned her head to Sadie, steady breathing, small fingers clutched around hers like a thread tethering her to the world. And Clara understood. She wasn't a guest anymore. The next morning came overcast but dry. The wind swept through the chestnut trees behind the house, their branches bare like bony arms raised skyward. Elias stood beneath one of them, clean shirt, hair combed, boots old but polished. Clara stepped out wearing a plain gray dress, no lace, no trim. Yet it fit so perfectly, it seemed she'd been born to stand in it. There were only 3 witnesses, Rowan, Sadie, and old Mr. Mick from the forge, who owed Elias a few seasons of grain and had agreed to hold a small Bible and say a few words. No music, no kiss, no flowers, just Elias saying, I won't hold you with anything you don't choose, but if you decide to stay, I won't let anyone take that from you. Clara nodded, then said, I can't promise to believe right away, but I won't leave without saying goodbye. That was their vow. Mr. Mick nodded, didn't smile, just exhaled softly like a blacksmith confirming the axe edge had been struck just right. Sadie clapped, once, twice, short and simple. Rowan said nothing, but for the first time his eyes settled on Clara without armor. Clara looked at Elias, and for the first time she really saw him. Not as a stranger, not as a shelter, but as a line drawn in earth, not a barrier, not a wall. Just a marker someone could choose to cross. Elias held out his hand. She didn't hesitate. When their hands touched, the dry soil stirred just enough to rise, a faint breath of dust lifting at their feet. Not much, but enough to draw a soft line beneath them. A moment Clara knew she would remember, not because it was beautiful, but because it was real. A wedding drawn in dust, no flowers, no iron rings, no words of love, but something rarer still, trust, learning how to take root again. On the 5th day after the wedding, the wind changed direction. The sky lit up with a strange brightness, not quite sun, not quite storm, the kind of light that made people step outside just to see what was coming. Willow Bend woke in a hush, as if even the land was holding its breath. Clara wore her brown cotton dress, basket of eggs in one arm, walking with Sadie past the rows of market tables, where the scent of apple pie and horse leather blended into something warm and weary. She didn't notice when Sadie's little hand suddenly clutched tighter. Didn't notice, until the crowd in front of them seemed to shift backward, as if something had pressed against the whole street at once. Then she saw him. August Trennan, so clean he looked out of place. Black overcoat with gold thread cuffs, gloves soft and spotless. The shine on his boots mirrored the grain of the nearest wooden post. He stood there, not angry, not smiling, but with the kind of disciplined civility meant to correct, like the whole town was a classroom that refused to learn. Delilah. The old name slipped from his lips like a paper cut. Not deep, but it stung. Clara didn't answer. Sadie stood close beside her. Clara gently nudged the girl toward Mrs. Neely's pastry stall, then turned back, still holding the basket of eggs. "This game has gone on long enough," August said, stepping forward. "Your father made a choice. He signed the contract. You are my lawful fiancé, and you will return before I send men to do it for me." He raised his head, letting his words drift toward the silent watchers. "She's not well. You can all see that. Hiding, using false names. Clearly unstable." A bootstep landed behind Clara. A slow movement, like the ground itself had come closer. Elias. He came forward, standing squarely beside her. He didn't speak right away. Just looked at August, the way a man might study the wind before pitching a tent. Then his voice came, calm, unhurried, like a stone rolling downhill. "She's my wife, and she's home." One sentence. But the whole town stopped breathing. Sheriff Rusk stepped across from the opposite side of the road, moving slowly, hands nowhere near his holster, but everyone could see the colt at his waist was awake. "What's this about?" he asked, tone flat. August turned and held out a scroll, thick, sealed in ink black as tar. "Legal betrothal, a contract, signed by her guardian. I'm here to reclaim what I have every right to." The sheriff took the scroll, read quickly, then reached inside his coat for a small ledger, the county marriage registry. He flipped a few pages, read, never looked up. "Says here she's Delilah Danner now." His voice was quiet enough it might have been for the book alone. August froze, just a second, but long enough to show he wasn't used to being refused. Wasn't used to power not working. This is a sham. He married her to cover for her. She's unwell, mentally compromised. Sheriff closed the book. "She's shown me nothing that calls for action, and unless you have a court order, this matter's settled." The crowd still stood, neither murmuring nor moving, but their silence leaned decisively in one direction. Clara looked at him. For the first time, not from behind someone, not from behind Elias. She met August's eyes as one who had crossed a desert and now looked back at an old rain she no longer feared. She didn't shake. The basket in her arms held steady, eggs balanced perfectly, as though her stillness itself was the message. He didn't have the power to break things anymore. August scanned the faces around him, began to realize no one would speak for him. No one would protect the title he brought. He pulled off his gloves, not in threat, but because they no longer fit the scene. Elias stepped gently toward Clara. He didn't touch her, but his breath near, the quiet tilt of his body toward hers, was a vow made without speaking. August turned, didn't bow, but his boots struck dust, deep, heavy, like they'd touched real ground for the first time. When he disappeared behind the wall of people, Clara exhaled. Not sharp, not broken, just a breath. Ordinary for anyone else, but for her, a victory once unthinkable. Elias turned to her gently. "You all right?" She nodded. Sadie ran back to her side, took her hand, that invisible thread pulling her home without ever snapping. Sheriff left without another word. leaving the air to settle, though it would never return to what it was. That day no one sold much, but everyone remembered. A man came to town wearing gloves and left with dust on his coat. Peace didn't arrive with bells. It crept in like early morning mist, unseen, unnoticed, until one day the cold left your hands without asking. Clara no longer curled by the hearth. Now, each morning, she stepped into the garden while the sun was still a red sliver behind the ridge. She worked the soil with calloused fingers, planted seeds one pinch at a time, with hands that just last year still trembled while holding a spoon. The first row of vegetables grew crooked, not straight, not pretty, but alive. That was all she needed. Elias built her a drying rack, said nothing, didn't wait for thanks. One afternoon, she came back from the henhouse and it was just there, wooden, solid, standing like it had always belonged in that corner of the yard. Clara hung her first wet dress over it in silence, but the way her fingers rested on the rope, gentle, almost reverent, was a thank you meant for no one to hear. Sadie laughed more now. The little girl followed Clara into the garden, hands covered in dirt, hair wild as weeds. One afternoon, Clara mended an old dress for her, tightened the seams, patched the hem with leftover cloth. She couldn't remember the last time she'd sewn for anyone. Maybe for her mother, in the final winter before everything collapsed. Sadie twirled in the sun, the dress fanning around her, then ran straight into Clara's arms like it was the safest place in the world. The hug had no words. But Clara understood. No one called her a guest anymore. Rowan still didn't say much. He followed Elias to the field, hammered nails, hauled water, did anything that kept him away from the house when Clara was inside. But one night, while clearing the table, Clara found a single sugar cube wrapped in wax paper, placed quietly beside her bowl of soup. No note. No eyes meeting hers. No one claimed it. She knew, and said nothing. The next morning, she folded Rowan's torn shirt, stitched an extra row of buttons to the front, and left it by his pillow. Forgiveness in this house wasn't spoken. It was passed in small, forgettable gestures, things the outside world might overlook, but between them, each one was a bridge. Clara started baking again. Not much, just a small batch from old ginger and leftover honey. The smell drifted through the house. Elias stepped in before dark, paused at the doorway, inhaled, and nodded. No compliment, just a look, enough to mean something. Clara placed a biscuit on his plate. No invitation, just presence. He ate quietly, but after the first bite, he nudged the plate a little closer to himself. They ate supper like always. No one mentioned August. No one spoke of papers, names, or the reasons Clara had come. But for the first time, there was no empty space at the table. They spoke of the weather, the lazy hens, the broken shovel. And in every unimportant story, Clara heard something she thought she'd been denied. Belonging. Elias didn't touch her, didn't lay a hand on her shoulder, didn't linger in his glances. He just stayed, on time, in place, in quiet. And Clara found she didn't need more than that. One misty morning, she caught sight of him in the yard, hammering together a frame, maybe a bench, maybe a porch seat. She didn't ask, but when he met her gaze, he said, "A place to sit, when your back's sore from the garden." Then lowered his head and kept working. Spring came slow to this land, not in wild blooms, but in thin blades of green pushing through dry soil, in droplets seeping from stone after a winter too long and too dry. Clara watered the seedlings, hands shaking from the cold, but she didn't stop. She touched the first mustard sprout like it held a secret, something small that survived and didn't need to be seen to be real. She wasn't sure what love looked like anymore, but she knew, if it existed, maybe it lived in someone building a drying rack, in someone leaving a sugar cube, in someone folding your shirt without being asked. And like the crooked rows of new greens, not perfect, but growing all the same, Clara began to believe she could live without hiding anymore. Spring touched the earth like a woman once cast aside, gentle, cautious, not asking to be trusted all at once. The chestnut tree behind the house budded with pale green leaves, soft as memories not yet stained. The scent of freshly turned soil mingled with the singed edges of gingerbread, drifting through the open doorway like a promise that didn't need repeating. Clara stood in the garden, hands muddy, dress hem hitched high, hair tied back with a piece of rough twine. She didn't sing, but her shoulders no longer braced. Her eyes no longer searched for exits. In the hush of morning, Elias walked toward her. He didn't call out, but she knew he was behind her before the wind even shifted. He said, his voice low and certain, like old wood, "I didn't marry you to save you." A pause. Only the drip of water from the eaves answered, steady, unbothered, unrushed. "I married you because I wanted to be the one you chose to stay with." Clara turned toward him, not fast, not startled, just turned, as the earth might tilt toward the sun after too long beneath snow. She didn't smile, didn't cry. She reached for him, and for the first time she held his hand. His hand was large, rough, smelling faintly of smoke and sawdust. Hers, thinner, softer in places that once were hard. Between their fingers hung the breath of another season, not cold, not burning, just warm enough to live. They stood there for a while, unmoving. Wind pushed through the crooked rows of mustard greens. A rooster crowed off-key in the distance. Then Elias leaned in, not rushed, not trembling. And when his mouth met hers, it wasn't a beginning. It was a recognition. No fireworks, no sky falling, just silence, finally stripped of its weight. A kiss not to claim, not to own, but to say, "You don't have to leave anymore." And in that moment, Clara understood. Where you go doesn't matter as much as knowing you've arrived. She pulled her hand from his, gently, but didn't step back. She simply looked at him. Her eyes no longer searched for a door, only settled, like a compass needle finally come to rest. Elias nodded, slow and true. There were no promises of forever, only two people who hadn't died in their own storms, now learning how to stand still, facing the same direction. That afternoon, Clara planted a new row of vegetables. Elias mended the back porch roof, leaving room for a swing. Sadie brought home a fistful of wildflowers and placed them in a cracked clay jar, just enough water to reach the stems. Rowan said something to Clara, short, forgettable to others, but enough for her to know he'd stopped gripping the past so tight. And that night, in the small kitchen, all four sat around the oil-lit table. No space left between chairs. Clara exhaled, soft as April wind through new leaves. And for the first time since running, she slept without dreaming of a door slamming shut behind her. Because some stories don't end with thunder. They end with a hand held, a quiet kiss, and a spring that grows where there was once only dead earth. If this story stirred something quiet in you, we invite you to leave behind a small silence with a like, a whispered thought with a comment, and a promise to return with a subscribe. At Wild West Love Echoes, We believe that hearts once forgotten still deserve to be heard. Just one more time.